And welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast. If you're listening live, then it is Sunday, the 9th of March. If you're listening to a podcast, it could be any time. So welcome to the podcast where we explore local, national and international issues with a cool and reasonable head to get to the heart of the matter. I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury. You could be cool and I can be reasonable.
Absolutely. And tonight we're local, but... Well, what does Pompey or Portsmouth even mean now? So we're looking at local government reorganisation and devolution, and we're joined by somebody who might know everything that's going on, but knows more than most.
Good evening, Cllr Steve Pitt.
Hello, both. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you for coming on and trying to make sense of this devolution / local government reorganisation stuff. Nice to have you back on. I'm sure it's occupied a lot of your time. So thank you for giving your Sunday evening. If you are watching the show live in portrait, there will be a version edited into landscape later on. But if you're just listening along audio, well, none of that makes any sense to you whatsoever, and it doesn't really matter. Shall I explain kind of what the current situation is, Ian, before we kind of get into trying to find out what the hell has happened?
I guess it's good to know that might be worth just introducing. So Steve is a longtime friend of the podcasts, and currently, possibly because you've been an awful human in a previous life, Steve, you are the current, is the title leader of Portsmouth City Council, or is there anything more grand?
That's correct, yeah.
Perfect. Simon, yeah, let's have a look and where do we stand now?
Okay, so are we all sitting comfortably? Okay, so there are three types of council currently in the region, which are county, borough, and unitary. With Portsmouth, Southampton, and the Isle of Wight are unitary authorities, whereas Havant, Gosport, Fareham are borough councils. Hampshire County Council is a larger, is the other tier of council that those residents living in areas that aren't unitary authorities also are part of. So we're not, as in if we're in Portsmouth, as we are speaking from not so sunny Portsmouth, we're a unitary authority, so we don't vote in Hampshire County Council. The County Council provides services that cover the whole of the county, such as education, waste disposal and adult social care, whereas district and borough councils cover refuse collection, environmental health and leisure facilities, and unitary authorities are essentially usually larger urban areas, so like Southampton and Portsmouth. Isle of Wight obviously being a bit of a slightly different case on its own. I'm sure we might get to kind of speaking about what the hell happens to the Isle of Wight in a minute, which have the powers of a borough and a county council. Portsmouth's been a unitary authority since 1997, and it has a whopping 42 councillors with 3 in each ward, and they are elected in thirds. So for 3 years out of a 4-year period, 1 in 3 councillors is elected, and one of the 3 councillors in each ward is elected. And then in the 4th year, because we're not part of Hampshire County Council, then we have a fallow year. So we have a spare year. Whereas in Havant, for example, they also elect in thirds. So in different boroughs, they have different numbers of councillors in different wards. But essentially, in their setup, they've got 3 councillors in each of their 12 wards. So for 3 of the 4 years, they are electing one of their councillors, and in the 4th year, they are electing their county councillor in one of the 6 divisions that are covered by Havant. Hampshire County Council, for example, has 48 councillors covering 46 divisions across the county. So the devolution idea, what the hell is all that about? Well, that seems to aim to remove the county council tier and replace it with a directly elected mayor, representing a combined authority. And in our case, that would be a combined authority area of what's now being termed as Hampshire and the Solent. So that is Hampshire County, the area covered by Hampshire County Council, plus the Isle of Wight, plus Portsmouth, plus Southampton. The combined authority will be made up of several authority areas, each comprising of at least 500,000 people. and the mayor's cabinet would comprise of a representative from each local or each of those authority areas. There's been some indication, although it kind of seems to go backwards and forwards, that the Hampshire and Solent area mayor or a member of their cabinet would also assume the responsibilities currently undertaken by the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Police and Crime Commissioner, and also the same for the fire brigade. The government plans are to eventually devolve powers and funding to mayors, giving them a multi-year financial settlement and the powers to be able to drive development, transport, and economic growth. And this is why Hampshire County Council voted to not have county elections this year, which doesn't affect Portsmouth at all because we're never due to have any, because Hampshire County Council might not exist in 2 years' time. And the mayors would also meet with the UK government in a council of the regions. This all sounds very, very like the setup in the Council of Europe. But let's not talk about that. Local government reorganisation, I guess the grand idea is that it is seeking to find organisation and efficiency savings by also combining multiple areas into an authority representing at least 500,000 people. So I don't know if you can see from those of us watching from our graphic, Portsmouth is around 210,000 people, so it isn't enough, doesn't meet the 500,000 people. So our kind of area needs to kind of take on other areas, and an example of that, it's by no means a hard and fast suggestion of this is how it would be. An example of how that might work would be that the Isle of Wight makes a case for being kind of left on it, being an authority on its own because of its unique geographical situation, whereas a Portsmouth area, for example, could include Havant, Fareham and Gosport, which would be about 527,000 people, whereas the Southampton area would be Southampton, Test Valley, Eastleigh, and the New Forest, which is about 700,000 people, and the Winchester area would kind of be the rest. That's just an example of just literally adding those up. That's my theory of how that, and that's my explanation. There won't be a test at the end.
Oh, absolutely. So thank you, Simon. So that's the current state. And I guess all of this news, Steve, broke just before Christmas. So can you give us, to start with, just a brief overview of what's happened so far, and kind of just give us an insight into where the process is currently?
Yeah, just before I do, Simon, you did a sterling job there of trying to lay that out, but there is just an organisational thing that I probably need to correct.
Oh, please do.
You didn't use the phrase upper tier local authorities, and that's the bit that's the relevant part around the devolution case. It's not the case that Hampshire needed to be dissolved for there to be a mayoral combined authority. You just need at least 2 upper tier local authorities, and by upper tier I mean Portsmouth, Southampton, the Isle of Wight and Hampshire, who basically are the ones that deliver those health and social care, waste disposal functions. They are the ones that need to agree to form a mayoral combined authority. So it's technically possible that we could have kept Hampshire and still had a mayoral combined authority. It's just that the government decided that wasn't going to happen as part of a separate piece of work around local government reorganisation. And that's why it's all getting confused, is they've tried to do all this in one go. And it's driving everybody mad. So what's happened to date? So we got the letter on the 16th of December. It was due in October, by the way. We were promised it by the end of October, which would have really helped to get it when we should have got it, because we would have had a bit more time to prepare, but we didn't. So we got it on the 16th of December, and we were given until the 10th of January to put in a response to say whether or not we wanted to be on something they are calling the Devolution Priority Programme.
Or the DPP.
Now, the DPP from here on in this evening, because otherwise we'll run out of time just by not using acronyms. So we were asked if we wanted to be on that. Now, the background to that is that there is no secret that historically I had a very poor relationship with the leader of Hampshire County Council when it was Rob Humby, who was a very strange character who went around saying what should happen around mayoral authorities without any consultation with the rest of us, and even publicly announcing such things and asking the government without telling anyone else. So that didn't go swimmingly well. But then he was replaced in May last year by Nick Adams-King, who took a very different approach and started to meet with Portsmouth, Southampton and the Isle of Wight. At that point, we were beginning to get that the mood music was that they wanted bigger areas. We'd historically always said we wanted the Solent. to be a mayoral combined authority, and that's what we've been pushing for. Didn't get support for that under the previous government. They weren't making the right noises. We knew from the Labour manifesto it was likely to be a thing now. So we thought, well, whether it does end up being one mayoral combined authority at two, the fact that we're having these conversations and that we know what our ambition is collectively for the whole area means we can start a conversation with the government. So back in September last year, we actually submitted our wish list, if you like, for all the things that we would like to see devolved into that new mayoral combined authority. Then we got to the Christmas bit, and we were given a steer on, get this in by the 10th of January. And at that point, they were clearly saying 1.5 million had to be the rough minimum population for there to be what they're now calling strategic authority, which is what was previously called a mayoral combined authority.
Excellent.
Yes, I know. So that's where we were. So we had a meeting and a discussion, and there were discussions within and across all the councils, and we decided that we waited too long and we were falling behind in not being able to draw down some of the powers from Westminster, such as Andy Street in the West Midlands have been doing, or the one everyone knows, Andy Burnham up in Manchester, and that we had an opportunity here to make the case to do that. So we decided to join the Devolution Priority Programme, and there was a key piece of information that made us decide to jump early and get on board, and that was we were told at the time that if we did, we would get more time to sort out local government reorganisation, which is the other bit that was included in the white paper. And that came as a surprise to everybody. Wasn't in the Labour manifesto, no prior warning. We got some jungle drums a couple of weeks out to say something might happen, but that was about it. So once that was announced, we knew that there were two parts to this, not one. And we decided to get on and submit to the priority programme and buy ourselves more time around the local government reorganisation bit. I'm going to stop there because this is literally something I can talk about, unfortunately, for several hours. But let's stop that bit and see if that's enough info for the time being.
Yeah, and I guess one thing just to add in there, Steve, is obviously from a political landscape. The leader of Southampton City Council is from the Labour Party. Yourself as a Liberal Democrat, Nick Adams-King as a Conservative. I'm not sure about the Isle of Wight, but independent. So it is that element of to move this forward. I guess to everyone's credit that the four of you might have been forced into a locked room together to move this forward, but it feels like, whilst you could argue you might not have had a choice, it does feel like this has come together pretty quickly. For you all to move together.
Yeah, I think that's very fair, and I just want to be clear to people that this was something we saw as a positive. The only question mark had been whether there would be two applications or one, and once we got the confirmation needed to be at least 1.5 million, it was clear that we needed to put in one application for the whole area. But all four of us were absolutely committed to trying to bring down more powers from Westminster to the wider Hampshire area to try and benefit our residents.
Perfect. Simon.
Okay, so I don't know whether we've kind of covered it in our explanation, but if there's anything else to add on, is because there is a lot of in the communications and stuff that people talk about. There's a lot of confusion between the devolution and the local government reorganisation bits, and they kind of merge in. What would you? Have you got anything else to add on to basically anything that helps explain the difference between the two, so that how they affect people?
Yes. So in most simplistic form, and this is not a simple thing at all, but in its most simplistic form, the principle of devolution is bringing powers down from Westminster to a devolved area. So in this case, the whole of Hampshire. The idea is that by having the powers vested more locally, we are better able to prioritise funding and strategize on which projects need to happen and in which order than a government in Westminster is. And everybody agrees that in principle, that is a good thing to do. Some of the things that DPP might unlock is the ability to look at planning more strategically. That is actually a mixture of coming down from government and going up a little bit from the councils, but we already do it through the Partnership for South Hampshire anyway. They will just have more power to act, whereas at the moment, Partnership for South Hampshire is kind of a consultative body rather than it is that has specific powers. I mean, we achieve quite a lot of stuff, but it will hopefully get more teeth under a mayor. The other things are things like economic growth, skills, strategic investment, infrastructure, particularly roads, perhaps finally grasping the issues around why it takes so flipping long to get to Southampton from Portsmouth and vice versa, either by rail, which is awful, or by car, which becomes awful because there's so many cars because people won't travel by rail, why there's no water link between the two, the ferry issues between the Isle of Wight, which significantly hamper both the delivery of public services and their economy. So there are a number of things there that we can look at working together that we will better be able to do with our local understanding than the government would. Full stop, draw a very hard line underneath that. Local government reorganisation is about the government forcing local authorities to move into expanded areas, so merge together, and in our case, across district and unitary boundaries, which is unusual and not something that's generally been part of this process to date, in order to create what they think will be more cost efficient and better able to deliver quality local services. And that's where we start to get into the territory of dispute.
Okay, I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute.
Oh yes, because that feels like the classic in business: bigger is better, economies of scale, back office savings. And I think anybody who's worked anywhere in the last 20 years will have heard such hopes and dreams spouted by accountants and have lived through the interesting reality of kind of what comes next. So if we look at what comes next, Steve, the starting gun has been fired. Would you like to be on board? And the answer is yes, because we'd rather be in the game than it coming to us later. And a lot of noise around cancelled elections and people getting very confused. And I think we're even confused as rather shrewd local podcasters in terms of, when elections might happen again and for what and when. Do you have an idea, or you will have some idea, on the current timeline and how those sort of, what the series of events are likely to be?
Yes. So for us, as Simon said at the beginning, we were never scheduled to have any elections this year. This is our fallow year. We were in the middle of a boundary review because we hadn't had one in Portsmouth since about the year 2000. So it was long overdue to balance up our wards to make sure that they were, as far as possible, electorally equivalent. To make sure we didn't have one ward with 20,000 voters and one with 10, to be simplistic. So we were a long way through that process, and we were actually about 9 days out from the result of that being announced by the Local Government Boundary Commission when we got the letter from the Minister of State on the 5th of February saying you're on the devolution priority programme, and that means you also need to do LGR, which was something else I'll come back to in a minute. So that causes us a problem because we had an expectation that next year we would be having an all-out election in Portsmouth, as you always have to when you've had a local boundary review. But now the boundary review's on pause. So our current expectation is that next year in Portsmouth, we will have our normal thirds election. And that's as much as I can tell you for definite about Portsmouth. Now, I would expect that if the vesting day, this is the word that's used to describe the day that a new unitary council would come into effect, if the government forces this through, is 1st of April 2028, which is what they're currently saying, that we would need to have a shadow election for that new unitary the year before. The way this works is that the existing local authorities are responsible for leading the transition, but at a certain point you have to do a handover, basically. And the shadow council that's elected in 2027 would then decide and help to set the budget that will come into force from the 1st of April 2028. And meanwhile, all the day-to-day services still need to operate, and hundreds of thousands of council officers will be running around like headless chickens, trying to make sure that they've properly, as best they can by the vesting date, amalgamated the services that then they'll have to collectively deliver. And to say that that is a vast piece of work is a massive understatement. But it poses an interesting question. If we're going to have a shadow election in 2027,
Yes.
on new boundaries, new ward boundaries across a larger authority, on what basis would you also then have your normal thirds election, which would be on different ward boundaries for people who would only serve for 1 year and then disappear? So we don't know, but our working assumption is that the government would suspend the thirds election in 2027 so that we weren't sending people to different polling stations to vote on different things for different purposes, which will be completely confusing for the electorate and pretty mind-blowing for the politicians as well.
Well, absolutely, Stephen, because, again, and without wishing to go down too much of a tributary, at the moment, as Simon touched on, Portsmouth has 42 councillors, and again, we're speculating, I know, with throwing Havant, Fareham and Gosport into one giant bucket, but it's feasible, the numbers work, don't they? But if you were to add the number of councillors in those four groups together, you'd be well north of 100 councillors.
You would.
So is the kind of, and I know not I, is the expectation that this new combined authority or what Portsmouth Plus is going to, you're never going to get home, because currently these things last 8-10 hours.
No, they don't since I became leader.
No,
They have efficient.
They have sharpened up a bit, but I fear if you've got over 100 opinions to be shared,
so
have you got any sense of that?
Yes, yeah. So that's why I'm saying that and I'm going to be very clear, I don't think it's possible to do this and do it properly on the government's timetable. The reason is that if you're merging districts and boroughs together, because they elect through, and I do apologise for everybody listening if this sounds immensely complicated, but it just is. They currently elect 2 Hampshire County Council on something called county divisions, which are different. It was on one of the maps Simon showed, actually, different to their ward boundaries for their borough councils. So they're bigger areas. Yeah, if you can pull up, that might be really helpful. Where is it?
Oh, hang on. It was.
It's in there somewhere. There we go. So the one on the right is clearly shows the county divisions. So I think, how many wards have they got in Havant, Simon? Is it 12?
12, yeah.
12.
Yeah. So they've got 12 wards with 3 councillors in each for their borough council. But for the county council, they've got 6 divisions. Now, those divisions, because it has to align up across the whole of Hampshire, it is broadly the case that each division across Hampshire elects with roughly the same number of electors. Now, it's not perfect, and there are differences, but it doesn't take a genius to work out that that's going to be broadly the case. So you've got a Hampshire County Council, it's all split into divisions, and each division elects a councillor to Hampshire County Council, and a couple of them are big and produce 2. So when you merge boroughs and districts with their upper tier functions of a county council, and you need to have an initial election to that new council, you can use the county divisions for that first election. And then what happens is that during the period where that first council serves, the boundary commission come in and they tidy it up. And that might mean that they don't stick to the county divisions anymore. They split them in half and come up with wards, but they work out what the optimum number of councillors is for that new unitary authority. And then there's a new election in 5 years' time on new boundaries. However, if you are merging a borough with a unitary, you don't have the same convenience of that unit of equivalency. So Hampshire, Havant, Fareham and Gosport have, for historic reasons, set their wards over certain areas. And we've got, You used haven't, Simon, which is a good example because that's the same as us. They elect in thirds. However, Fareham and Gosport elect in halves and have 2-member wards. So you can't just use their wards because you would have 3 members being elected in the Portsmouth and Havant wards and only 2 in the Fareham and Gosport one. So that doesn't work. And if you use the county divisions to elect to the new council in Fareham, Gosport and Havant, that doesn't work because they've got significantly more electors than our city wards do. So what I'm saying is, in order to get this right and it not be a complete dog's breakfast from day one, the Local Government Boundary Commission is going to have to look at whatever the new unitary council is that incorporates what is currently Portsmouth and do a full reorganisation so that when we elect to it, we are doing a democratic election with as much electoral equivalency as we can. Now, there's another good reason for doing it. If we were forced into a shotgun wedding with Fareham, Gosport and Havant, who incidentally, they're not particularly mad about getting married to us either.
No.
There is a little bit of Havant that's on the wrong side of the A3 and borders Drayton and Farlington. So if you were going to redo the ward boundaries, you wouldn't leave that split across a motorway as it currently is. There are a few houses on the edge of Paulsgrove that are in Portchester. So again, you'd tidy that up. So if we're going to do this properly, we need to do it at the beginning and not further down, or otherwise we'll have exactly what you said, because the only way we could do it is on the county divisions. And that means that we would have, I think it's 97 councillors in the first iteration of this council. And you could, well, you've already said what that would be like. And apart from anything else, on the practicalities, there isn't any council chamber at the moment in the 4 authorities that is big enough for us to meet in. Because there aren't enough, there's just enough space. So we'd have to be hiring out the Guild Hall or somebody else's hall in order to hold council meetings, loads of extra cost. You know, it's just ridiculous. So we need to get to a practical number of councillors, but we need to make sure that they are then representative of the area because they're going to be making some very big decisions in their first term.
And I think that's and thank you for wrestling with that, Steve, because I think what it's showing us is that, you know, you are, you know, there are going to be some really serious kind of decisions to be made. And, you know, with integration, there is always that challenge of, well, would we adopt what you do or do you adopt what we do?
Exactly.
And obviously that's got to be done in a measured and controlled and sensible fashion. But it feels like at the moment, kind of, you know, there are lots of things on the table as to how that could be done. I guess so. One of the key questions is, have you any sense of why there appears to be such an ungodly rush to push this through?
Well, there's a number of possibilities. The main one, I believe, is that, and this is what I think happened. I think Angela Rayner and her civil servants went to see the Chancellor and her civil servants, and they said, look, the Local Government Association, which is a cross-party representative body for local government in England, has turned around and said, there's an £8 billion funding gap for local authorities by 28-29 just to sustain the services they are now delivering. And bear in mind, Portsmouth lost £110 million of its funding over the last 15 years. But just to keep doing what we currently do and what everybody currently does, there is an £8 billion funding gap. And I think the Chancellor scratched her head and her civil servants have all had a sharp intake of breath. And they've said, oh, we haven't got £8 billion to give to local government by 2028-29, but we've got this report that PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers Consultants, did in 2020, and it shows you can make huge savings in local government if you throw the whole thing up in the air and redo it all from scratch across the 21 existing counties. So let's do that then. And that apparently, from nothing else makes much sense, Angela Rayner and her civil servants said, well, okay, that's what the Chancellor says. Rachel from Accounts is running the country. So what Rachel from Accounts says obviously goes. So we better go and do that then. Of course, the weird thing is that those estimates were that if all of this was done and it all worked out perfectly, as a bunch of consultants said it will, big question mark about that, especially since their latest report has roughly halved the savings it will make, and we're now down well under 2 billion. and we've got an £8 billion whole black hole here, remember, they're still going to have to cough up an extra £6 billion or we're all going bust. The scale of which this is crazy makes no sense. But if it is being driven by the Exchequer, and I truly believe that the local government reorganisation piece is, it's all about the money, folks. And they convince themselves that this will save them some cash, even though pretty much everyone on the ground thinks it might make some initial savings on day one. But unless you address the core funding issues for local authorities all over the country, it won't.
Yeah,
it just won't work because they're demand-led services and they're not being fixed.
No, and I think that's the, for those people who've followed our podcast for a number of years, I think when we look at those, when we look at the annual budget, whilst we might have a bit of fun at the some of the horse trading on the floor, ultimately the size of the pie, which is or the slice of pie, which is discretionary, gets smaller and smaller each year as the must-dos kind of fill up, and
Yeah.
and yeah, I think you've kind of reinforced what Simon and I might have discussed privately in terms of the rationale behind this. The only thing that makes any sense is if somebody somewhere has said, well, if you kill them all and let God sort it out, then I'm sure there's going to be billions of pounds in savings. And I'm sure PwC have offered to facilitate such a change at very reasonable hourly and day rates.
Not
So
as if
cynical,
it's not in their interest
so
to create
cynical
the
in
very
one, so
situation they
young.
bid for.
But but actually, the interesting thing about that report was it was written for the county council's network, so it wasn't commissioned by the government. And if you remember, in the latter stages of the last, probably about halfway through the last Tory government between 2015 and 2024, there was a move towards creating county unitaries. And that was seen that some of the smaller unitaries were falling over. Districts and boroughs had been out borrowing huge amounts of money and gone bust. And they thought, well, maybe if we tidy all this up into one piece of local government, we'll be able to address some of these issues. So look at places like Northamptonshire, happened in Cumbria. The one that I always refer to is Somerset. Well, they said to everybody, you've all got to join together. Going to be one county council there because we need to sort out the finances across the piece. And the day it became a unitary council, vesting day, it was £76 million in the hole in its revenue budget from day one, and it's been struggling ever since to try and set a balanced budget. So that worked really well, didn't it? It's seen as a fix, but there's little evidence to say it is one. And if we think bigger's better, then everybody needs to have a look at Birmingham.
Yeah, it seems like it's trying to teach a toddler to swim by holding them underwater for 5 minutes.
Yep. Well, I've used the analogy. It's like asking you which new suit of clothes you'd like to wear while you're about to be put under the knife for open heart surgery. It's completely ridiculous, and almost everyone agrees. I mean, the irony of it is, if you look at it purely on a political level rather than a financial level, look at places like Worcester and Gloucester and Cambridge and Oxford, all with Labour councils. As soon as they expand up to 500,000 to meet this arbitrary target that PwC scribbled on the back of a fag packet 5 years ago, then those councils will not be run by Labour councillors because they are surrounded by Tory shires. And as soon as they expand into those areas, those intergenerational Labour councillors that have run those town halls for years and years and years, they'll all be gone. So I know I'm a Liberal Democrat critiquing this, but go and ask the Labour council leaders if they think this is a good idea. Tudor's the leader down in Plymouth. If he expands to 500,000 people, he ends up with Plymouth and a rather large amount of sheep and not very many extra people in order to get to 500,000. So, and it ends up as an enormous unitary authority with most of it having no relationship whatsoever to Plymouth, where over 200,000 people live. This is barking, frankly, but it is what the government has dictated we have to do.
There's a strange kind of irony, isn't there, in a piece that's aiming to push power down out of Westminster, but because it's actually how it's being designed and how it's being delivered isn't actually ground up, it's actually top down.
Yes.
So the weird thing is you will have this freedom and it will take the shape that we want, rather than areas actually having the freedom to decide what sort of freedom and powers they would want to have kind of together. It does seem.
Yeah, there is a fundamental democratic deficit in this, in that they told us on the 5th of February that they wanted an answer by the 21st of March, a provisional answer on what our proposals would be around local government reorganisation. Less than 6 weeks, and that no time to consult the public. Well, there's some fundamental issues here. If you're going to create new unitary councils, and they're going to be in place for 50 plus years, because that's roughly how often government actually grasps this nettle and tries to sort it out. Although I have to say, usually they make a slightly better stab at it than this. But if you're going to do that, then I want to know whether people who live in Fareham Gosport and haven't think that they want to go in with Portsmouth. You should at least ask people and talk to them. Also want to know whether the bits around them think that if you are going to just rub all the lines out and do it again, that, does Rowlands Castle really believe that it's got more affinity with Alton than it's got with Portsmouth? Does it believe it should be in a new Winchester or East Hampshire based unitary, or does it think, well, actually we look to Portsmouth for everything? I just want to ask them. If they say no, we don't look to Portsmouth, then fine, but we should ask them. And if we don't, and we don't have those conversations, same goes for Suffolk and Denmead. And if this new unitary is going to be forced on us, and we end up with going in with our colleagues in Fareham, then at the moment Whiteley is split across 2 different councils. Part of it's in Winchester, part of it's in Fareham. And then let's open the can of worms that is everything west of the River Meon, where most of the Fareham wards have SO postcodes, not PO postcodes. Which acute hospital do they go to? Do they go to QA, or do they go to Southampton General? Where do they go for their shopping and to access key services? Do they go into Southampton, or do they come to Portsmouth? And let's put it out there, which football club do they support? Because if at the end of all of this, we ended up with a new leader of this unitary council who lived in an SO postcode and wore Southampton kit, went to to St Mary's on, show my age there, St Mary's on Saturdays to worship at the altar of Southampton Football Club, you can just imagine what the reaction would be in Portsmouth.
Not
and
great.
So we ought to go and ask those communities, because if they all come back and say they face Portsmouth, fair enough. But there would be a lot of mistrust early on that, why have we got Southampton postcodes in Portsmouth? These things need to be talked through properly, and there needs to be time to consult with people. And at the moment, it's being rushed to a ridiculous speed that is just setting it all up to fail before it even gets going.
I guess giving people a choice is dangerous if there's a chance they're going to say no.
Well, why shouldn't they be able to say no?
Yeah, and I think there is that element, Steve, isn't it? When we look at Hampshire as a whole, and my job now means I cover the whole of Hampshire apart from Southampton, and they are such. I've got some of my team are out in the New Forest, very, very different demographic to Portsmouth. We head up to Basingstoke. Well, I would argue that Basingstoke probably has more affinity with Surrey and London than it does with Hampshire. If we sort of, and it appears that the kind of logic is Southampton gets bigger, Portsmouth gets bigger, and we'll just lump the rest together. It doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't. Or it doesn't feel like.
If you were to say that in Basingstoke and Dean, Paul Harvey, who's the leader of Basingstoke and Dean, would be very, very vociferous in his point of view that he wants to go in into a new Northern Hampshire unitary and wants nothing whatsoever to do with the rest of it, because they have different priorities and that they have a different identity, and they're very clear on that, those 3 councils up there, and that should be their right.
And I think that makes absolute sense. Again, when we start looking at the demographics of Hampshire, and you look at Winchester, and you think, well, kind of Winchester's the next big town that isn't in that sort of the Southampton footprint. It's 5 minutes from Eastleigh. It's only just across the border. If we're creating artificial borders, this thing all looks slightly crazy. And again, I guess we're going to go out of order on the questions here. But I guess what what is this likely to mean for the residents of Portsmouth?
Well, there are a lot of unknowns, but
Mm,
there's one thing that we do know, and that is that Hampshire is 216 million pounds in the red, and it's not debt. So
yep,
let's be clear, Hampshire's debt is not 216 million pounds. Hampshire's annual gap in its revenue budget, in other words, in setting a balanced budget,
yep,
is 216 million pounds and continuing to go north. Now, they approached the government for extra financial assistance this year, as Southampton did last year, and got it. Hampshire were refused it on the basis that, well, you've still got a couple of £100 million in revenue reserves. You can use that to cover your budget deficit this year. So those reserves have been built up over a long period of time in order to create financial resilience and be able to deliver key services. And the government has literally ordered Hampshire to spend them all in one go to plug the gap for a year. So they've taken Hampshire taxpayers' money to plug that gap and refused government assistance. That's fine. That's they can do that.
yep.
I think it's appalling, but that is what's happened. However, that's just for 1 year. So when we get to the following year, there's another £216 million gap because it hasn't gone anywhere. It's just been paid off with reserves. That's why we've got a problem.
And I
Because if
think,
you then break up Hampshire and we get a big chunk of it, then a big chunk of that £216 million revenue gap each year comes over into a new council that includes Portsmouth. And we know where the pressures are. They're around adults and children's social care. They're around temporary accommodation. If we bring in bits of the county, it will also bring in home to school transport pressures and increasingly SEND pressures. And these are all demand-led services, and they are all going north very, very quickly because government is not solving the core problem of council funding, and it's just not taking it seriously. The whole system will collapse if this is not reviewed. So we could, as it stands, end up with 4 or 5, however many new unitaries in Hampshire, and they could all be bust on day one.
and I think, Steve, if we, and again, just to follow the logic through on that, because I was very aware with Hampshire County Council that they went through a really big consultation process last year because they were projecting a funding gap of, I think, 183 million, then 195 million. And they went into a really big consultation around recycling, around bus provision, dozens and dozens of different areas where they went into consultation with a view of saving money. And at that point, there were about 180 million pounds in the hole. That
Yeah,
rose to 190 something. They concluded all their consultation. They made various cuts, which felt, they had impact in small groups, but they weren't swathing. And that 195, as you point out, has now become 216 after they've done all their consultation on where could we trim a bit to close the gap.
yeah.
And I can't remember I think the figure for Southampton was about 170 million in terms
I
of,
think it was less than that, but yeah.
yeah, but it runs north of 100 million, doesn't it? It's not it's not pocket change.
No, it's not. It's a lot of money. And Hampshire and Southampton, to be fair, have managed to deal with a big chunk of their deficit, but they are still going to have issues to sort out in the coming years. And we've got pressures too.
Yeah, yeah,
Our,
yep.
our pressures on children's social care are about 10 million. It's 3 or 4 on adult social care. We've got a £6 million temporary accommodation problem. This is happening to local authorities all over the country. It's not unique to us. It's a commonality when you look across issues that all these councils have. So the only way it gets dealt with, if these services are to remain statutory and demand-led, is more government funding. Or you've got to bite the bullet and you've got to whack up council tax by 10, 15, 20%, as Hampshire wanted to do this year. You can't just not do anything because these councils will collapse. And I know for a lot of people who don't access social care, that they think that there's huge amounts of waste and, oh, you're not balancing the book because you waste a load of money. That's not the case. There is a huge increase in the cost of delivering social care, and there is an increasing demand for social care. So those people who need it and need to access it, it has to be there. So the government just going, oh, well, you need to reorganise and become more efficient. It ain't going to happen. I mean, I'll give you an example, because you just referred to those savings in Hampshire last year, or actually for this financial year they've just gone through. And one of them was to close 12 tips across the Hampshire authority area, because Hampshire run the tips.
Yeah.
So the local politicians in each of those places where those closures were proposed obviously went out screaming and shouting, you can't close our tip, we need our amenity tip, blah, 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 blah.
Good
So
leaflet
Hampshire
writing
backed down.
material.
Yeah, exactly. And all politicians will do that. And actually, they're right to. They should be fighting for their residents. A local amenity, why should they lose it? However, some of those tips, well, in fact, all of them, will now be in new unitary councils if this goes ahead. And those unitary councils will have inherited the debt. So tips are going to close, aren't they? That's an inevitability. Yeah. Only now they're going to have to be dealt with by the very people that were shouting and screaming at the county council will now be having to vote those cuts through. That's why this gets so difficult. So the districts and boroughs have made huge amounts of savings over the years, but they've protected the bits that they've protected. But some of the big ticket stuff is not in their remit. And tips and waste disposal, those sorts of things, large costs that are going to be passed back down to that unitary council, they're now going to be a part of. And those tough calls are going to have to be made. There are 21 libraries across Portsmouth, Fareham, Gosport and Havant. 21. That's a lot of libraries. So it doesn't take a genius to work out that when these difficult decisions come and there's a big revenue deficit on day one, people are going to go after the libraries. People are going to go after the fact that Portsmouth have community wardens, but Fareham, Gosport and Havant don't. Why should Portsmouth keep community wardens if we can't have them? We want them too. Well, we can't afford that because we've got to make these cuts because we've inherited a budget deficit. Oh, then that means Portsmouth can't have community wardens. You can just imagine how all this starts to play out as time goes by and these new councils come into force. It's going to be hell on earth.
So, I mean, that kind of takes us neatly to the question that we had about what, you know, in Portsmouth's example, what does this kind of mean on the ground for the residents? What would
those sorts of things?
What would they see? But also in their relationship with their council and the services provided. Is it so rather than it being a rising tide lifting all boats in it and it kind of increasing the provision of services? Actually, it might be that they all go to the lowest common denominator.
Is that exactly that? So, and remember, at the moment, councillors in Gosport, Fareham or Havant can blame the county council for those cuts, and they do. But they won't be being made by the county council, being made by them. So the residents in those places have got used to the fact you can blame the county council for some of these services disappearing. Who do you think they're going to blame when these cuts inevitably come? They won't have a county council to blame anymore. They're going to blame whoever they have currently as their councillors in their area, because this is really complex and they won't understand it at the beginning. And you will see a big political churn start to happen when they realise that actually turkeys have voted for Christmas.
Which will be happening just at the time when you actually really want experience.
And you need people to be aligned and working together, and particularly working across party, and you'll need that to carry it through. But inevitably, we'll already have lost probably close to half of the councillors that currently sit in Fareham, Gosport and Havant when we do the boundary changes anyway, and maybe as many as a third of the ones in Portsmouth. So there's already going to be a big change. And then we're going to have a lot of vengeance going on as local services are hacked away because the money's not there to pay for them. This is such a divisive thing. I was on a call with Angela Rayner the week after she became Deputy Prime Minister, and she promised a new relationship with local government, that they would listen, that it would be respectful, that they would treat us differently, that it wouldn't be like it was under the Conservatives. And it's 10 times worse.
No, and I think you've spelt it out, Steve. That there is that fundamental, a shift change, and one of the things you're always taught to do with major change initiatives is first be very clear and articulate to those experiencing the change why it's happening, and the second is you never try and do more than one massive change at the same time.
No,
and this feels like no one's, well, if the why is cost saving that hasn't been articulated. It's been, dressed up in, oh, it's more power to your elbow. Well, that's, more power sounds great. Cost cuttings, or shall I, austerity 2.0 perhaps doesn't have the same warm ring to
No.
it. And then at the time we're asking you to deliver all of that, then we'll be, no one will entirely be sure, who their elected representative is, because we'll just keep moving all the chairs and taking some away and putting new ones in place. So I guess as we scratch our heads, and I really appreciate you coming to take the time on this one, Steve, because I get a sneaking suspicion that there might be more to come on this over the coming months. We might need to talk again at some point. So
Yeah.
I guess one of the fundamental questions, because we are Pompey centric, is this the end of Portsmouth City Council, or can you see any route? We don't particularly want, we've talked about the shotgun wedding. They don't particularly want to marry us. We don't particularly want to marry them. And you see any way where PCC could end up surviving the other side of this?
Yes, it's a long shot though, and it would involve a big shift by the government on the criteria it's currently put forward. And that's why I'm saying that we need to get on the slow train on this and allow other people to move first, and let the government realise just what a mess all this is, and let's start making some compromises. So it might be that, for example, they start abandoning the 500,000 number. There's no indication at the moment that they will, but they
Yep.
might do. And if they did, you could imagine a situation where Portsmouth may be expanded a little bit, and that some of our neighbours merge together to form new councils. Who knows? That's their business, frankly.
Yep.
But that's a possibility. And that might mean that we end up with a slightly expanded Portsmouth, but not part of a new massive unitary. But at the moment, I'd say it's a long shot at best. What I think is more likely to happen is that Rachel from accounts gets a boot, and somebody else comes in and thinks, why on earth are we doing this, and stops it all. I think of the two options, that's the more likely at the moment. Although, as it stands, they're being quite clear that if you can hear a funny noise in the background, by the way, it's my dog having a funny 5 minutes after dinner. He does that. He's 13 and a half. He still does it. And so somebody else might come in and say, what, this is just ridiculous. This is diverting a huge amount of time and resources. Let's just leave it alone. And what we'll do is what I want them to do now, which is set up a local government commission, work out how to do this properly, and then do it over a 5 to 7 year period, which is what everybody agrees is the proper time frame to do it over. And then we might get a better outcome, because the one thing to go back to is not necessarily whether Portsmouth will still exist. Why the hell does Hampshire need to still exist? What is it? It is the old chief exec we had at the council used to talk about feudal boundaries, and it is. Well, if it's not going to have a county council anymore, what's the point of it? Who relates to it? Who says I'm from Hampshire? I don't know anybody that does that. That's certainly not around the urban conurbations. That's not a thing. So you earlier on, when you were talking, Ian, quite rightly about the way North Hampshire views itself, it looks north and it looks east. It doesn't look south.
No.
So why is it that a feudal boundary drawn on a lap because somebody got some land for the king for doing the right thing for him 500-600 years ago, or in some of these cases 1,000 years ago, is the right way to redraw the map for local government now? But it blatantly isn't. I mean, that's just silly. So we're going to end up with some of these false resolutions coming forward now. I saw we got some modelling done by the consultants that all of the local authorities in Hampshire have worked up. And one of the maps had a suggestion, and these were just illustrations, I know that. But one of the maps showed, well, in order to make this work, you could bring East Hampshire in with Portsmouth. So what relationship has Portsmouth got with people in Alton? That's completely mad. So the only way this is done well and done properly is rub all the lines out across all the maps and say, right, What's the right way to do this? Set up a commission, consult with local communities, do the granular work on the economy and where the social care demands are and where people shop and where they feel an affinity to, and then draw something up that makes sense. And actually doing it that way, they wouldn't need to have a vote on it at the end. You just say, look, we've done all this consultation and this is what these people have told us. This is what the evidence shows. This is where those new local authorities could be. But saying they want to do it on the building blocks of existing districts and boroughs that may or may not have been got right 50 years ago. I mean, I'll give you an example. Did you know that Test Valley primarily exists, apparently, because Lord Louis Mountbatten didn't want Romsey to be in Southampton? So they created a council that went, oh, all right, we'll use the Test River then, and we'll create a council through that, and that will be... What relationship is there between Totton and Andover? It's completely ridiculous, all of it. Whereas a place like Portsmouth does have an identity, a very clear identity. It knows what it is. It might not like itself very much sometimes, but it knows what it is, and it's very passionate about it. And everybody knows where they come from if they're in Portsmouth. Similar in Southampton. You know, some level of expansion probably makes sense, but to just delete it from the map and say, we're now going to have East Solent Council. Who the hell is going to have an affinity with that or even know what it is? So
Well,
this is
yeah,
mad.
If I look back in the annals of football history, there was the plan to merge Reading and Oxford to become the Thames Valley Royals.
Yes, I remember
and
that.
I remember just how well that was received by both sets of supporters. So, Steve, I think you've been incredibly generous with your time this evening. I mean, as I say, I think this one is going to run and run, and you know, it's one of those things sometimes when we look at political issues, you know, as politicos, we all get quite vexed by them and interested, and Simon gets to do a bar chart and all of these good things. But this is going to fundamentally impact the way people live their lives, as you say, probably over the next 50 years. So very much appreciate you taking the time tonight. And I think we might have to, I think there might be another episode or two in this, Simon, do you think?
Could well be.
Probably more than that. I mean,
I think we're looking at a mini series.
Yeah, just one without any planning, because it seems like the government are in a deathly rush to do a thing that's ill-defined and is designed to try to provide a solution to a problem that it won't solve.
Exactly. That's very good. That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. In which case, I think on that nutshell, oblique bombshell, you've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And our guest has been
Cllr Steve Pitt.
And I've been Simon Sansbury. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you again, Steve, for trying to help us make sense of that as that nailing jelly to the wall exercise takes place. And credit to, was it Councillor Lee Hunt, or was it came up with the shotgun wedding?
Yeah,
I think that was a Lee Hunt thing. So if you're going to be joining us next week, we'll be having a look at a debate on assisted dying, and then the week after we're doing a bit of stateside stuff. We've got a political Republican expert, campaigner, and author from Florida coming on the show to talk to us about stateside politics and about how the events over the last couple of weeks, I'm sure there'll be a couple of more, how they read actually in Florida. So see you then. Don't forget to like, follow and comment on Facebook, or comment and subscribe on YouTube. Find us on all the social media platforms: Facebook, X, YouTube, Threads, LinkedIn.